All right, on to lesson two. Lesson two is going to cover the time period or the policy of prohibition. One of the first times that the U.S. government steps in and begins to regulate or make changes to the economic climate in America is after World War I in 1919, along with passing the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote under President Wilson. They did pass another amendment, the 18th Amendment, dealing with prohibition. And so our next lesson has to do with prohibition, and your learning target focuses on that you can describe how the policy and the laws of prohibition led to the rise of organized crime in America. And so we're going to give you a short overview of prohibition, what the amendments are that deal with prohibition and what they mean. And then the lesson that you do today will be a web quest that goes through and introduces you to ways that the prohibition laws led to organized crime in America. Groups such as Al Capone, the mafia, the mob, they're all going to be involved in this anti-prohibition movement. And so I just want to give you a short overview. To start with, it's very important to know what the word prohibition means. And prohibition is any law that makes it illegal to buy, sell, and even make alcohol. Okay, we're going to outlaw the manufacture, the buying, and the selling of alcohol in America. So how this starts out is the 18th Amendment, which states that after 1 year from the ratification of this article, which was in 1919, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into, meaning you can't bring it into the United States, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. And what this means is that it is illegal to manufacture, which means to make, to sell, or to transport any type of alcohol within the United States, so from state to state, or out of the United States into another country, or from other countries into the United States. And so they're basically controlling there is no alcohol being permitted selling to and from. Okay. So to kind of start us out, all right, we're going to look at why would America allow for prohibition? Okay, so I'm going to show a video here just a moment about why this idea of prohibition was created and what happens as a result. Okay, so let's look at this video. I'm going to play it here for you. Oh, I forgot. I got to hit present in order to do this. Bear with me here. I forgot to hit the present button. Here we go.
U.S. Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. The growing temperance movement in the 19th century and the Anti-Saloon League had argued that drinking alcohol was damaging American society by destroying families and creating corruption. During the First World War, as America entered the conflict in 1917, Woodrow Wilson put a temporary end to the manufacture of alcohol to save grain for the war effort. Religious and moral reasons also fueled the desire to restrict alcohol. The anti-drinking movements took advantage of this to encourage the government to make prohibition a permanent law, and in January 1919, the amendment was ratified as part of the Constitution. It began in the United States in January 1920, after the 18th Amendment became effective, making the manufacture and sale of alcohol now illegal. Even though arrests for drunkenness initially declined, the law was very difficult to enforce as public demand surged for illegal alcohol. On top of this, there weren't enough prohibition agents to enforce it. Bootleggers found inventive ways of manufacturing and selling liquor. They created homemade moonshine or bathtub gin and smuggled it into cities and bars. Some bars became speakeasies. In order to sell illegal alcohol, they were secret. Because of the shared problem of prohibition, all kinds of people from different sections of society gathered in them. One such group that owned many of the speakeasies and profited from the prohibition were organized crime groups. Al Capone and Bugs Moran battled for control over the bootlegging and speakeasy trade, resulting in gang violence and a shocking crime wave across America. Between 1927 and 1930, there were hundreds of gang murders, with the most famous being the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago in 1929. Al Capone's men, some dressed up as policemen, killed several members of Moran's gang with machine guns while lined up against a wall. the murders were never officially linked to Capone. Eventually, Capone was brought down by a Prohibition agent named Elliot Ness for violating Prohibition law and tax evasion. In the same year, the Wickersham Commission had reported how Prohibition had been failing. Many Americans never wanted the law, and Prohibition agents were too few in number and easy to bribe. As well as this, it was clear that crime had risen rather than decreased before alcohol was illegal. In February 1933, Congress passed the 21st Amendment, ending Prohibition. During Prohibition, millions of dollars worth of business went to bootleggers instead of the brewing industry. Subscribe for more history videos.
Okay, so as we see, Prohibition was a very controversial law and amendment that was added to our Constitution. In the beginning, it showed you the reasons why people did support Prohibition in the beginning. When a lot of soldiers came home from the war, they were very, PTSD was not a disease, was not something that was attributed to soldiers coming home from war, especially considering that was the first major war that had ever happened in the world. And so the atrocities and the deaths and the way these men died in Europe during World War I was just so unspeakable that a lot of these soldiers came home and they turned to alcohol to ease their PTSD, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, and all the things that had happened. And so what happens is they become addicted to alcohol, leading to an increase in alcoholism, an increase in violence because of that, domestic violence, child abuse. These were on the rise during the 1920s. You also have a lot of deaths associated with those who were addicted to alcohol, and a lot of sicknesses. And so religious groups who, if you remember back in American History 1 in 1840, they were already trying to get people to, the temperance movement, if you remember, was already trying to get people to prohibit alcohol. That temperance movement was not successful in 1840, but it was still there. There were still groups that supported the temperance movement all the way into the 1920s. And so in 1919, the temperance movement won a big victory in the fact that the 18th Amendment was passed. A lot of religions, Christianity, but a lot of other religions also supported the idea of prohibition because their foundations did not believe in the consumption of alcohol. And so a lot of them joined with this prohibition movement as well. As we see, Prohibition did not end up being what a lot of people foresaw that it was going to be. Sure, there was a lot less domestic violence at this time, but those who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, suicides rose because they had no outlets. And of course, remember at this time, that is not a diagnosed disease. And so people, there's no treatment for it. They're not going and talking about it. They're not going and seeing therapists or working through their depression and their post-traumatic stress. They're having to find ways to cope, and many of them can't. So you have a rise in suicides, especially among ex-military. You also have a rise in organized crime. And so that's what today's lesson is going to kind of focus on. We do know that the 21st Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1933. It actually repealed or took away the 18th Amendment so that alcohol was once again legal in the United States and their territories. And so Prohibition was not successful, but it is one of the first attempts of the U.S. government in recent times to interfere and to make reforms and changes within the economic climate of the United States. And so as you can go into lesson 2, this is what the focus is going to be. At the end of lesson 2, you should be able to tell how Prohibition is linked to the rise of organized crime within the United States. Best of luck. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns.